The Boeing 757 shuddered against the turbulence at 37,000 feet, its cabin lights flickering like dying stars against the storm clouds that pressed against every window. Isabella Brown pressed her face against the scratched plastic of seat 12F, watching lightning fork through the darkness beyond. Preparing and narrating this type of story takes a lot of time and effort. If you like the story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you want to watch every story of our channel, turn on the bell icon. She had been trying to get the flight attendant's attention for nearly 40 minutes. It started small, as emergencies often do. A slight metallic taste in the recycled air. The barely perceptible shift in the engine's hum that made her stomach clench with recognition. This sound, this subtle change in pitch was wrong. "Excuse me," she had called softly to the blonde flight attendant who swept past her row for the third time, arms laden with drink trays. The woman's name tag read Brittany, and her practiced smile never wavered as she continued down the aisle without acknowledgement. Isabella tried again, louder this time. "Miss? I think we might have an engine issue." Brittany paused mid-step, turning with the kind of patronizing patience reserved for anxious passengers. "Ma'am, I can assure you everything is perfectly normal. Commercial flights experience turbulence all the time. Perhaps some ginger ale would help settle your nerves." But Isabella knew the difference between turbulence and mechanical failure. She had felt this exact vibration pattern before in the cockpit of an F-22 Raptor over the skies of Afghanistan, when hydraulic systems began their slow, catastrophic dance toward failure. Her hands unconsciously moved to her lap, fingers tracing the outline of the challenge coin hidden in her jacket pocket, its edges worn smooth by decades of nervous handling. "I'm not nervous about turbulence," Isabella said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard in life-or-death situations. "I'm telling you that your number 2 engine is developing a harmonic vibration that suggests bearing failure. We need to contact the captain immediately." Brittany's smile tightened. Her eyes swept over Isabella's casual travel clothes, faded jeans, a simple gray sweater, worn sneakers, taking in the absence of any uniform or badge that might lend credibility to such a bold statement. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but I think it's best if we let the professionals handle the flying, don't you?" She watched Brittany continue down the aisle and felt the familiar burn of being invisible. It was a sensation she had grown accustomed to in the years since her retirement, the way people looked through her as if her expertise had evaporated the moment she traded her flight suit for civilian clothes. Around her, the other passengers remained blissfully unaware of the growing mechanical symphony that played beneath their feet. A businessman in 12 East typed furiously on his laptop, his tie loosened after what must have been a long day of meetings. Across the aisle, a young mother tried to soothe her crying infant while her toddler kicked relentlessly against the seat back in front of him. 3 rows up, an elderly man snored softly, his head tilted at an uncomfortable angle against the window. None of them heard what Isabella heard, the subtle changes in pitch that spoke of metal, stress, and impending failure. None of them understood that their lives might depend on the expertise of a woman they saw only as passenger. 127. Isabella opened her leather journal and found a particular entry from 2007. A scared 18-year-old from small-town Montana who had never been on an airplane before joining the military. Now it contained the record of a career that had taken her from trainee pilot to squadron commander, from the deserts of Iraq to the mountains of Afghanistan, from air shows that thrilled thousands to classified missions that would never appear in any official record. Her fingers found a particular entry from 2007, written in the cramped confines of a forward operating base outside Kabul. "Engine bearing failure at 23,000 feet, she had written in her precise script. Recognized the harmonic pattern immediately, metallic resonance at 3.7 kHz, with secondary vibrations every 4.2 seconds. Emergency landing at Bagram. Aircraft total loss, But crew survived. The exact same pattern she was hearing now. Isabella closed the journal and tried a different approach. She pressed the call button above her seat, its soft chime barely audible above the engine noise. When no one responded after 5 minutes, she pressed it again. And again. Finally, a dark-haired flight attendant named Marcus appeared at her row, his expression already weary with the assumption that he was dealing with another anxious flyer. "Yes, ma'am. How can I help you?" "I need to speak with your captain," Isabella said, her voice steady despite the urgency clawing at her chest. "You have a developing mechanical issue that requires immediate attention." Marcus glanced around the cabin, noting the general calm of the other passengers. "What kind of mechanical issue?" "Your number 2 engine is developing bearing failure. The harmonic signature is unmistakable. You have maybe 20 minutes before complete seizure." The flight attendant's eyebrows rose in surprise. It wasn't often that passengers used technical terminology with such precision. Still, protocol was protocol. "Ma'am, are you a licensed mechanic or pilot?" Isabella hesitated. The truth was complicated, a decorated military career that had ended not in glory, but in a painful bureaucratic battle over a classified incident that had cost her everything she had worked for. Her retirement had been early and involuntary, the result of political maneuvering that had left her with a pension and a silence that ate at her. "So, I have aviation experience," she said. Carefully. Marcus nodded with the kind of polite dismissal that Isabella had come to recognize. Aviation experience could mean anything: a private pilot's license, a few flying lessons, or simply someone who watched too many episodes of air disasters on television. Without credentials to back up her claims, she was just another passenger with an opinion. "I'll make note of your concerns," Marcus said, already turning away. "But I'm sure our captain has everything well in hand." Isabella watched him disappear toward the galley, her hands clenching into fists in her lap. She knew what would happen next. Her concerns would be filed away as the nervous ramblings of an overcautious passenger, if they were recorded at all. The crew would continue their service, the pilots would maintain their course, and the bearing in engine number 2 would continue its inexorable march toward failure. She thought of the faces in the cabin around her, the businessman with his laptop, the young mother with her children, the sleeping elderly man. She thought of the crew members who had dismissed her concerns with practiced efficiency, all of them trusting that the systems around them were functioning properly, that the people in charge would recognize danger when it appeared. But Isabella knew better than most that expertise could be invisible. That knowledge could be discarded simply because it came from an unexpected source. She had spent her career breaking barriers, one of the first women to fly combat missions in the F-22 Raptor, the first female squadron commander in her wing, a trailblazer who had earned her place through skill and determination rather than politics or connections. Now, at 37,000 feet above the Nebraska plains, she was just another middle-aged woman in coach, her warnings dismissed as quickly as her experience had been forgotten. Engine vibration was getting worse. Isabella pulled out her cell phone, knowing it was useless at this altitude but checking anyway. No signal as expected. She considered her options, running through emergency procedures that had been drilled into her over thousands of flight hours. In the military, she would have had direct communication with air traffic control, the authority to make command decisions, the respect that came with rank and responsibility. Here, she had nothing but her voice and her knowledge, neither of which seemed to carry any weight with the crew. She opened her journal again, this time to a page from 2003, written after a particularly difficult mission over Baghdad. "Sometimes the hardest part of command," she had written, "is knowing when to trust your instincts even when everyone around you thinks you're wrong. The enemy doesn't announce itself with fanfare, it whispers in frequencies. Only experience can hear." The words felt prophetic now, written by a younger version of herself who had never imagined she would one day be the one whose warnings went unheeded. Isabella looked around the cabin again. at the passengers who continued their conversations and activities, unaware that their safety might depend on whether she could find a way to make herself heard. The taste of metal in the air was stronger now, and beneath the constant background hum of the aircraft, she could hear the growing irregularity in the engine's rhythm. Time was running out, and with each passing minute, the probability of catastrophic failure increased exponentially. Isabella Brown, retired lieutenant colonel, former F-22 pilot, and current passenger 127, pressed her call button one more time. This time, she would not be ignored. Isabella's morning had begun at 4:30 a.m. in a modest apartment in Colorado Springs, where the shadow of Cheyenne Mountain served as a daily reminder of the life she had left behind. The apartment was small, just 2 bedrooms, one of which she had converted into an office filled with aviation manuals, framed photographs, and the accumulated artifacts of a military career that had ended too soon. The walls were painted a neutral beige that the landlord had chosen, but Isabella had added touches of her own, a carefully maintained collection of model aircraft suspended from the ceiling, each one representing a different phase of her flying career. Her morning routine was as precise as any pre-flight checklist. Coffee, first strong and black, brewed in the same stainless steel pot she had used in squadron ready rooms around the world. Then 30 minutes of physical training, a habit ingrained by decades of military discipline. Push-ups, sit-ups, and a 3-mile run through the quiet streets of her neighborhood, past houses where families were just beginning to stir. The run was her thinking time, when the rhythmic pound of her feet on pavement helped organize her thoughts and prepare for whatever the day might bring. This morning, like every morning for the past 3 years, she had found herself mentally reviewing flight procedures, analyzing weather patterns visible in the pre-dawn sky, and fighting the persistent ache of purposelessness that had settled into her bones like arthritis. Isabella showered and dressed carefully, choosing clothes that struck a balance between professional and approachable. She had learned through painful experience that first impressions mattered more in civilian life than they ever had in the military, where rank and uniform provided instant context for her expertise. Today's outfit was typical of her new normal: dark jeans that fit well without being tight, a light blue blouse that brought out her eyes, and a navy blazer that made her feel more confident when dealing with skeptical audiences. The drive to Denver International Airport had given her time to review her presentation materials one final time. Today's speaking engagement was at a veterans workshop focused on transitioning to civilian careers, and Isabella had agreed to share her experiences despite the discomfort it caused her. Her transition had been anything but smooth, a fact that made her both qualified and reluctant to offer advice to others facing similar challenges. The workshop itself had been held in a sterile conference room in one of the airport hotels, filled with 24 veterans ranging in age from their early 20s to their late 50s. Isabella had seen herself reflected in their faces, the mixture of pride and uncertainty, the way they sat with military straightness even in casual clothes, the careful way they listened as if waiting for orders that would never come. Her presentation focused on translating military skills into civilian terms, finding ways to communicate expertise without relying on jargon or assumed knowledge. It was advice she wished she had followed better in her own transition. Too many job interviews had ended with polite rejections after she had failed to articulate why her combat flying experience made her qualified for corporate positions that seemed to require entirely different skill sets. The hardest part, she had told the group, isn't learning new skills. It's learning to explain the skills you already have in language that civilians understand. When I say I managed air-to-ground operations in hostile environments while coordinating with multiple agencies under extreme time pressure, most hiring managers hear military jargon. When I say I successfully led complex projects requiring split-second decision-making and precise execution while managing teams across different time zones and competing priorities, they hear business skills. After her presentation, A young Marine named David had approached her with questions about finding purpose after service. His left arm ended at the wrist, a souvenir from an IED explosion outside Fallujah, and his eyes carried the particular kind of fatigue that came from having seen too much too early in life. How do you keep going when it feels like everything you trained for doesn't matter anymore? He had asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Isabella had looked at this young man, probably younger than most of her former squadron members, and felt the familiar twist of recognition. She remembered asking herself the same question during her own darkest moments after retirement, nights when she lay awake wondering if all those years of training and sacrifice had been worth it, if they led to nothing more than speaking engagements at airport hotels. "You find new ways to serve," she had said, the words feeling inadequate even as she spoke them. "It's not the same, and it never will be. But there are people who need what you know, even if they don't realize it yet." The conversation with David had stayed with her during the flight boarding process, adding another layer to the complex emotions she carried with her everywhere. Isabella had chosen her seat carefully, 12F, a window seat that would give her the best view of the aircraft's engines during flight. It was a habit from her military days, when situational awareness could mean the difference between life and death. Even in civilian travel, she found herself unconsciously conducting visual inspections and listening for any anomalies in the aircraft systems. As she settled into her seat, Isabella had pulled out her journal and made a brief entry about the workshop. Writing helped her process experiences, a practice she had started during her first deployment and maintained even after retirement. The journal served as both a record of her days and a connection to the person she had been when purpose had been clear and mission had been paramount. The other passengers had boarded with the usual mixture of travel, fatigue, and destination anticipation. Isabella had watched them file past her seat, each absorbed in their own stories and concerns, none of them aware that they shared the cabin with someone who had spent her career ensuring the safety of aircraft and crews. It was a peculiar kind of anonymity to possess knowledge and experience that could prove crucial, while being completely invisible to those around her. She had been particularly struck by the young mother struggling with her infant and toddler, remembering her own sister's difficulties traveling with small children. The businessman with his laptop reminded her of her brother-in-law, always chasing the next deal or presentation. The elderly man who had fallen asleep almost immediately after takeoff could have been her own father, who had passed away 2 years earlier without ever fully understanding what his daughter had accomplished in her military career. These observations weren't mere people watching. They were part of the heightened awareness that had been trained into her through years of combat flying. In hostile airspace, every detail mattered. Every anomaly could signal danger. Every person and situation required assessment and classification. The habits of survival didn't disappear just because the environment had changed from combat zone to commercial airliner. When Isabella had first detected the engine irregularities, her initial response had been to trust her training and experience. She had spent thousands of hours listening to aircraft engines, learning to distinguish between normal operational sounds and the subtle changes that preceded mechanical failure. The harmonic vibration developing in engine number 2 was unmistakable to anyone with the proper background, but that background was precisely what made her warnings seem improbable. To the flight crew, the dismissal she had experienced from the flight attendants was painfully familiar. During her transition to civilian life, Isabella had encountered similar reactions in job interviews, networking events, and social situations. Her military achievements, which had once opened doors and commanded respect, now seemed to create distance and skepticism. Civilian employers weren't sure what to do with a former combat pilot, especially a female one whose career had ended under circumstances she preferred not to discuss. The truth was that Isabella's retirement had been involuntary, the result of a classified incident that had cost her security clearance and ended her flying career overnight. The official record showed an early retirement with full honors, but Isabella knew the reality was more complex. She had been quietly forced out, her reputation tarnished by whispered accusations of pilot error that she couldn't refute without revealing classified details of the mission. The experience had left her with a deep distrust of authority and a bitter understanding of how quickly expertise could be dismissed when it became politically inconvenient. Now at 37,000 feet above the American heartland, Isabella found herself once again in the position of possessing crucial knowledge that others were unwilling to hear. The irony was not lost on her. She had spent her career protecting American lives, and now American lives were potentially at risk while she sat helpless in seat 12F, reduced to pressing call buttons and making polite requests that were being ignored with increasing efficiency. The engine vibration was becoming more pronounced, and Isabella could see stress patterns developing in the wind structure that suggested the problem was worse than she had initially thought. Her training told her that they had perhaps 15 minutes before the situation became critical, yet she remained powerless to communicate this urgency to anyone who could act on the information. She thought about David, the young Marine who had asked about finding purpose after service. Perhaps this was her answer, not a grand return to military glory, but a simple moment when her knowledge could make a difference, if only she could find a way to make herself heard. The question was no longer whether she could save her career or restore her reputation, but whether she could save the lives of everyone aboard this aircraft. Isabella closed her eyes and listened to the engine's changing rhythm, letting her trained ears separate the normal sounds from the warning signs that spelled potential disaster. Somewhere ahead, the flight deck crew was making decisions based on incomplete information, trusting in systems and procedures that hadn't accounted for the presence of a former combat pilot in seat 12F. The challenge now was finding a way to bridge the gap between knowledge and action, between expertise and authority, between who she had been and who she needed to become in this crucial moment. The first real sign that Isabella's warnings might carry weight came from an unexpected source. As she sat in mounting frustration, watching the flight attendants continue their routine service while the engine vibrations grew steadily worse, she noticed a man in uniform making his way down the aisle from first class. He wore the dress blues of an Air Force major, with ribbons that told the story of a career still in progress, deployment medals, commendation ribbons, and the distinctive wings of a pilot pinned above his left breast pocket. Major James Rodriguez had been returning from his father's funeral in Denver when he heard Isabella's increasingly urgent requests for attention from the flight crew. Unlike the civilian attendants, his trained ear had caught something in her voice, a quality of controlled urgency that spoke of someone accustomed to emergency situations. When she mentioned specific technical details about engine bearing failure, using terminology that few people outside of aviation would know, his curiosity was piqued enough to investigate. "Ma'am," he said quietly, approaching her seat with the respectful bearing of someone who recognized authority even when it wasn't wearing a uniform. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation with the flight attendants. Are you in aviation?" Isabella looked up at this young officer, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of alert intelligence that she remembered from her own squadron members. His question was polite but probing, and she could see him taking in details, the way she held herself, the confidence in her voice when discussing technical matters, the subtle signs that marked her as someone with more than casual knowledge of aircraft operations. "I was," she replied carefully. 23 years in the Air Force. I flew F-22s. Major Rodriguez's eyebrows rose slightly. F-22 pilots were rare enough that most Air Force personnel knew them by reputation, if not personally. The Raptor community was small and elite, and anyone who had flown combat missions in the aircraft would have credentials that commanded respect throughout the aviation world. "Which wing?" he asked, the question carrying the weight of professional verification. "First Fighter Wing at Langley. then the 94th Fighter Squadron. I did 3 combat deployments, 2 in Afghanistan, 1 in Syria. Isabella's voice carried quiet pride despite the circumstances that had ended her career. Major, Rodriguez nodded slowly. He had heard stories about the Syria deployment, though the details remained classified above his clearance level. What mattered now was that he was speaking with someone whose aviation expertise was unquestionable. "What are you hearing?" he asked, settling into the empty middle seat beside her. Isabella felt a surge of relief at finally being taken seriously. "Number 2 engine is developing bearing failure. Listen." She gestured toward the floor, where the subtle vibrations were transmitting through the aircraft structure. "The harmonic pattern is unmistakable. We probably have 10 minutes, maybe less, before complete seizure." Major Rodriguez closed his eyes and focused on the sounds around him. At first, all he could hear was the normal background noise of commercial flight air circulation systems, passenger conversations, the steady drone of engines. But as he listened more carefully, filtering out the familiar sounds, he began to detect what Isabella had been hearing for the past hour: a subtle irregularity in the engine rhythm, a metallic resonance that spoke of machinery operating outside its normal parameters. "Jesus," he whispered. "How long has it been like this?" "Getting worse for the last 45 minutes. I've been trying to get the crew's attention, but ... Isabella gestured helplessly toward the galley, where the flight attendants continued their service routine, oblivious to the growing mechanical crisis. Major Rodriguez stood up, his expression grim. "I need to talk to the captain, now." He made his way forward, past the service galley where Brittany was arranging drinks on a serving cart. When she saw him approaching in uniform, her demeanor shifted immediately to one of respectful attention. "Is there something I can help you with, Major?" she asked, her voice carrying the deference that Isabella had been denied. "I need to speak with your captain immediately," Rodriguez said, his tone carrying the unmistakable authority of a military officer accustomed to being obeyed. "We have a potential emergency situation." Brittany's practiced smile faltered. "What kind of emergency?" "Engine malfunction. The passenger in 12F is a former Air Force pilot who's identified what appears to be bearing failure in your number 2 engine. I've verified her assessment, and we need immediate attention from the flight deck." The transformation in Brittany's attitude was instantaneous and complete. The woman who had dismissed Isabella's concerns with patronizing efficiency now moved with urgent purpose toward the cockpit door. Within moments, she returned with the captain, a gray-haired man in his 50s whose expression conveyed both skepticism and concern. Captain Michael Hayes had been flying commercial aircraft for nearly 30 years, working his way up from regional carriers to his current position with a major airline. He had dealt with his share of passenger concerns over the years, and had learned to distinguish between genuine issues and the nervous imaginings of anxious flyers. However, when a uniformed military officer requested his attention for a potential emergency, protocol demanded that he take the matter seriously. "Major Rodriguez?" the captain said, extending his hand. "I understand you have concerns about our engines." "Not me, sir. The passenger in 12F. She's a former F-22 pilot with extensive combat experience. She's identified what she believes to be bearing failure in your number 2 engine." Captain Hayes looked past Rodriguez toward Isabella, who was still seated, but watching the interaction intently. Even from a distance, he could see something in her bearing that suggested military training: the alert posture, the way she observed her surroundings, the controlled calm of someone accustomed to emergency situations. "I'd like to speak with her directly," the captain said. The 3 of them made their way back to Isabella's seat, drawing curious glances from nearby passengers who sensed that something unusual was happening. The businessman in 12 East looked up from his laptop, while the young mother paused in her attempts to calm her fussy baby. "Ma'am, I'm Captain Hayes," the pilot said, extending his hand. Major Rodriguez tells me you have concerns about our engines? Isabella shook his hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact that suggested this man, at least, was willing to listen. Captain, you have bearing failure developing in your number 2 engine. The harmonic signature is consistent with advanced metal fatigue. I estimate you have less than 10 minutes before complete seizure. Captain Hayes listened carefully as Isabella detailed her observations, using precise technical language that demonstrated intimate knowledge of aircraft systems. Her description of the vibration patterns, frequency analysis, and failure progression was exactly what he would expect to hear from a qualified engineer or experienced pilot. "What's your background?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Lieutenant Colonel Isabella Brown, retired. 23 years Air Force, most recently commanding officer of the 94th Fighter Squadron. I've logged over 4,000 hours in tactical aircraft, including extensive combat operations. The captain's expression grew more serious. Squadron commanders didn't achieve their positions without demonstrating exceptional competence and judgment. If someone with Isabella's credentials raising concerns about aircraft safety, those concerns deserved immediate attention. "I need to check with my co-pilot and run some diagnostics," Captain Hayes said. "Can you give me a few minutes?" Isabella nodded, watching as the captain returned to the cockpit, with Major Rodriguez following close behind. For the first time since the flight began, she felt hopeful that her warnings were being taken seriously. The presence of a uniformed officer had provided the credibility that her civilian appearance had failed to convey. But at least the message was finally getting through. However, their conversation had not gone unnoticed by other passengers, and word began to spread through the cabin that there might be a problem with the aircraft. The businessman in 12 East closed his laptop and leaned across the aisle. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice tight with growing anxiety. "I heard something about engine trouble." Isabella tried to remain reassuring while being honest. "The captain is checking on some concerns I raised. Everything's being handled properly," but her words did little to calm the mounting tension that was beginning to ripple through the passenger cabin. The young mother overheard the conversation and clutched her baby closer, her eyes wide with the kind of primal fear that comes with being trapped in a dangerous situation with children to protect. "Are we going to crash?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "No," Isabella said firmly, drawing on her command experience to project calm authority. "The crew is aware of the situation and taking appropriate action. These aircraft are designed with multiple backup systems specifically for situations like this." But even as she spoke the words, Isabella could hear the engine vibrations growing worse. The metallic resonance was now accompanied by intermittent, grinding sounds that suggested the bearing failure was accelerating beyond her initial estimates. They might not have 10 minutes after all. In the cockpit, Captain Hayes was discovering that his instruments were not sophisticated enough to detect the subtle changes that Isabella's trained ear had identified. The engine monitoring system showed parameters within normal ranges, though some readings were approaching the high end of acceptable limits. Without more sensitive diagnostic equipment, he couldn't definitively confirm or deny Isabella's assessment. "What do you think?" he asked his co-pilot, First Officer Sarah Chun, a former Navy pilot who had transitioned to commercial aviation 5 years earlier. Chun studied the engine readouts carefully, then listened to the aircraft sounds with the kind of focused attention that Isabella had been employing for the past hour. As a former military pilot, she understood the importance of trusting experienced judgment even when instruments didn't provide clear confirmation. "The readings are borderline," she said slowly. "But if a former squadron commander says she's hearing bearing failure, I'm inclined to believe her. The consequences of ignoring her warning are a lot worse than the consequences of taking precautionary action." Captain Hayes nodded grimly. In aviation, the burden of proof always fell on the side of safety. If there was even a possibility that Isabella's assessment was correct, He had no choice but to act accordingly. He picked up the intercom microphone, his voice carrying throughout the passenger cabin with the kind of calm authority that pilots learn to project even in crisis situations. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're going to be making a precautionary landing at Kansas City International Airport due to a minor technical issue with one of our engines. This is purely a safety measure, and there's no immediate danger to the aircraft or passengers. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing." The announcement triggered exactly the kind of passenger anxiety that Isabella had been hoping to avoid. Around the cabin, people began talking in urgent whispers, pulling out cell phones to check for signals, and looking toward the windows as if they might be able to see evidence of the engine problem from their seats. The young mother began to cry softly, holding her baby tightly while trying to comfort her toddler, who had picked up on the adult anxiety and begun to fuss. The businessman demanded to know more details about the technical issue, his voice rising with each question that went unanswered. Several other passengers chimed in with their own concerns, creating a growing chorus of worried voices. Isabella found herself in the unexpected position of being a focal point for passenger fears. Word had spread that she was the one who had identified the problem, and people began approaching her seat with questions she couldn't answer without creating more panic. "How bad is it really?" asked an elderly woman from several rows back. "Are we going to make it to Kansas City? Is this the kind of thing that causes crashes?" demanded a middle-aged man who had clearly spent too much time watching aviation disaster documentaries. Isabella tried to balance honesty with reassurance, drawing on her command experience to manage the growing crisis of confidence among the passengers. She explained that engine failures, while serious, were situations that commercial pilots trained for extensively. She described the multiple backup systems built into modern aircraft and emphasized that precautionary landings were routine procedures designed to ensure passenger safety. But her efforts to calm the situation were undermined by the worsening sounds from the engine, which were now audible even to untrained ears. The grinding noise had become more pronounced, accompanied by occasional metallic screeches that made several passengers visibly flinch. Major Rodriguez, who had returned from the cockpit after speaking with the captain, took a seat across the aisle and helped Isabella field questions from increasingly anxious passengers. His uniform and calm demeanor provided additional reassurance, though both pilots could tell that the situation was deteriorating faster than anyone had anticipated. "How much time do we have?" Rodriguez asked quietly, his voice pitched low enough that nearby passengers couldn't hear. Isabella listened carefully to the engine's changing rhythm, her face grave. "Less than I thought. The bearing is disintegrating faster than normal, probably due to a manufacturing defect or maintenance issue. We need to get on the ground in the next 5 minutes, or we're going to have a much bigger problem." The announcement came from the cockpit a moment later, confirming Isabella's worst fears. Kansas City International was 20 minutes away at current speed and altitude. They were running out of time. Transformation began with a single radio transmission that Isabella couldn't hear but somehow felt in her bones. As Captain Hayes worked with air traffic control to coordinate their emergency approach to Kansas City International, word of their situation was spreading through aviation channels with the kind of efficiency that only existed in the interconnected world of modern flight operations. At Kansas City Approach Control, Senior Controller Diana Martinez was coordinating the emergency landing when she noticed something unusual in the flight plan data. United Flight 847 was declaring an emergency based on engine bearing failure identified by a passenger described in the crew's communication as a former Air Force Squadron commander. The specificity of that designation, combined with the precise technical language being relayed from the cockpit, triggered a memory that made Martinez reach for her secure telephone. 20-5 minutes away, at Whiteman Air Force Base, The phone rang in the operations center of the 509th Bomb Wing. Staff Sergeant Kevin Thompson answered on the second ring, his routine afternoon shift about to become significantly more interesting. Whiteman Operations. Sergeant Thompson speaking. "This is Kansas City Approach Control," Martinez said, her voice carrying the controlled urgency of someone dealing with an in-flight emergency. "We have a commercial flight declaring emergency landing due to engine failure. The crew reports that a former Air Force Squadron commander identified the problem, someone with extensive F-22 experience. I'm wondering if you might have any information about former wing personnel in the area." Thompson paused, his training clicking into gear. Former F-22 pilots were rare enough that their movements often remained of interest to Air Force intelligence, particularly those who had held command positions. He transferred the call to his supervisor, Master Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez, who immediately began accessing classified personnel databases. "Can you give me more details about this pilot?" Rodriguez asked, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she pulled up records of former squadron commanders with F-22 experience. Martinez relayed the information she had received from the commercial crew. Lieutenant Colonel Isabella Brown, retired, former commanding officer of the 94th Fighter Squadron, currently aboard United Flight 847 as passenger 127. The name triggered immediate recognition in the Air Force database. Isabella Brown's file was marked with security classifications that indicated her involvement in sensitive operations, including the classified Syrian mission that had ended her career. More importantly, her psychological profile and performance evaluations painted the picture of an officer whose judgment and technical expertise were beyond question. Master Sergeant Rodriguez felt a chill of recognition as she reviewed the file. 3 years ago, she had been part of the team that had processed Isabella's involuntary retirement, and she remembered the quiet injustice of watching the decorated combat veteran become a political casualty. Now, it appeared that Isabella's expertise might be the only thing standing between a commercial airliner and disaster. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said to Martinez, "you need to know that Lieutenant Colonel Brown is one of the most experienced combat pilots the Air Force has ever produced. If she says there's an engine problem, you can bet your life that there's an engine problem." The conversation, that approach to Sedalia Regional Airport, would later be studied in aviation schools as a masterclass in emergency procedures under extreme conditions. Isabella's hands moved across the unfamiliar commercial aircraft controls with the fluid precision of someone whose muscle memory had been trained in far more challenging circumstances. Every input was deliberate, every adjustment calculated to compensate for the asymmetric thrust and compromised flight characteristics of an aircraft operating on a single engine. "Flaps to 20 degrees, she called to Captain Hayes, who had assumed the role of her co-pilot with remarkable grace considering the unprecedented nature of their situation. "We're going to need every bit of lift we can generate for this approach." The runway at Sedalia Regional stretched ahead of them, 5,000 feet of asphalt that would normally provide an adequate safety margin for a commercial airliner, but seemed impossibly short for their current emergency situation. Isabella had calculated their approach speed, accounting for the additional weight of fuel they couldn't dump and the reduced control authority that came with single-engine operations. "Destroyer flight. This is Colonel Brown," she transmitted to the F-15 escorts maintaining formation alongside them. "I need you to confirm runway conditions and emergency equipment positioning." "Colonel Brown. Destroyer lead. Runway is clear. Emergency equipment is standing by at both ends. Fire and rescue vehicles are positioned every 1,000 feet along the runway perimeter. Medical helicopters are on standby at the terminal building." Isabella felt a surge of gratitude for the thoroughness of the emergency response. The Air Force had mobilized resources on a scale that demonstrated not just professional courtesy, but genuine recognition of her expertise and the value of the lives she was protecting. It was a level of support that she had never received during the political controversy that ended her career. In the passenger cabin, the atmosphere had shifted from panic to tense anticipation. Major Rodriguez had done an excellent job managing passenger anxiety, but everyone could sense that they were approaching the critical moment when their fate would be determined. The young mother held her children close, whispering soft reassurances that she hoped would prove true. The businessman had abandoned his laptop and was gripping his armrests with white-knuckled intensity. Throughout the cabin, passengers were following the age-old ritual of emergency landings, reviewing safety cards they had ignored during normal flight, locating exit rows, and making the kind of desperate bargains with fate that crisis situations inspire. 2 miles out, Captain Hayes announced, his voice steady despite the sweat beading on his forehead. Approach speed holding at 140 knots. Isabella made minute adjustments to their descent path, compensating for crosswinds and the unpredictable flight characteristics of their damaged aircraft. The F-15 escorts had moved to a higher altitude to avoid interference with the landing approach, but their presence remained visible to passengers looking out the windows, a reminder that the full resources of the United States Air Force were focused on bringing them home safely. 1 mile out, landing gear down and locked, the hydraulic systems were still functioning, though Isabella could feel the vibrations from the failed engine affecting the aircraft's structural integrity. Every control input required more force than normal, and she could sense the airplane fighting her attempts to maintain precise flight path control. 500 feet. Captain Hayes called. Approach speed good. Sync rate within parameters. Isabella could see the runway threshold approaching with crystalline clarity. Years of combat flying had trained her to maintain hyper-aware focus during critical moments, filtering out distractions and concentrating entirely on the essential elements of aircraft control. The touchdown would require perfect timing. Too early, and they would strike short of the runway. Too late, and they wouldn't have enough distance to stop before running. Off the far end, 50 feet, 40, 30. Main landing gear touched the runway with a firm thump that sent vibrations throughout the passenger cabin. Isabella immediately deployed thrust reversers on the remaining engine, while Captain Hayes applied maximum braking pressure. The aircraft decelerated rapidly, emergency vehicles racing alongside them in perfect synchronization with their rollout. Welcome to Sedalia Regional Airport, Isabella announced over the cabin address system, her voice carrying a mixture of relief and quiet pride. Ladies and gentlemen, we're safely on the ground. The cheer that erupted from the passenger cabin was unlike anything Isabella had ever heard, a sound that combined relief, gratitude, and genuine celebration of life preserved. Passengers were crying, laughing, and applauding simultaneously, their emotions spilling over in the kind of spontaneous demonstration that occurs when people realize they have survived something that could easily have killed them. As the aircraft rolled to a stop, surrounded by emergency vehicles with their lights flashing in the afternoon sunlight, Isabella felt a profound sense of completion. For 3 years, she had struggled with the question of whether her military service had been worthwhile, whether the sacrifices and dedication had meant anything beyond the political convenience that had ended her career. Now she had her answer: 127 lives saved by the expertise she had developed over 23 years of military flying. Captain Hayes turned to her with an expression of pure gratitude. "Colonel Brown, I don't know how to thank you. Without your knowledge and experience, we would have lost this aircraft and everyone aboard." Isabella looked out at the emergency vehicles surrounding them, at the F-15 escorts circling overhead in a victory formation, at the passengers who were beginning to realize how close they had come to disaster. "Captain, this is what we trained for. This is why we serve." The evacuation proceeded with textbook efficiency, passengers exiting through both main doors, while emergency medical teams conducted rapid health assessments. The young mother emerged with her children, tears streaming down her face as she repeatedly thanked Isabella for saving their lives. The businessman, his earlier impatience completely forgotten, shook her hand with the kind of genuine respect that transcended any differences in background or experience. But the most meaningful moment came when Major Rodriguez approached Isabella as they stood on the tarmac, watching the last passengers disembark safely. "Ma'am," he said, coming to attention with military precision. "On behalf of every person aboard that aircraft, and on behalf of the United States Air Force, thank you for your service." All of it. The emphasis on those last three words carried special meaning recognition, not just of her performance during the emergency, but of her entire career, including the classified missions and political controversies that had driven her from service. For Isabella, it represented the validation she had been seeking since her involuntary retirement. Within hours, word of the emergency landing was spreading through aviation communities worldwide. The story of a dismissed passenger whose expertise had saved 127 lives captured public imagination in a way that transcended the usual boundaries of news cycles. Isabella found herself at the center of media attention that she had never sought but couldn't avoid. The interviews were conducted at Whiteman Air Force Base, where she had been invited as an honored guest while the investigation into the engine failure proceeded. Sitting in the same type of military briefing room where she had once conducted mission planning, Isabella tried to explain to reporters what had happened from her perspective. "I wasn't trying to be a hero," she said to a room full of journalists and cameras. "I was simply doing what any qualified pilot would do when they recognize a dangerous situation. The real heroes were the flight crew who listened to my concerns and acted on them, and the Air Force personnel who responded so quickly and professionally." But the media narrative that emerged focused on the dramatic irony of her situation, a highly qualified expert who had been ignored until circumstances forced recognition of her expertise. Stories appeared in newspapers and magazines around the world, describing Isabella as everything from the passenger who saved Flight 847 to the retired pilot who proved expertise doesn't retire. The attention brought unexpected consequences. Job offers arrived from aerospace companies, consulting firms, and government agencies that had previously shown no interest in her qualifications. Speaking engagements were offered at aviation conferences, military institutions, and corporate events. Universities reached out about teaching positions, while publishers inquired about book deals. More importantly, the publicity prompted a comprehensive review of her involuntary retirement case. Pentagon officials, embarrassed by the contrast between Isabella's heroic actions and the bureaucratic treatment she had received, ordered a formal investigation into the circumstances that had ended her career. Congressional representatives demanded explanations for why such a capable officer had been forced out of service under questionable circumstances. 6 months after the emergency landing, Isabella received an official letter from the Secretary of the Air Force. The investigation had concluded that her retirement had been based on political considerations, rather than legitimate concerns about her performance or judgment. While her separation from service couldn't be reversed due to the passage of time, the Air Force was prepared to offer her a civilian position as a senior aviation safety consultant, with authority to review emergency procedures and training protocols. Offer represented more than just a job. It was institutional recognition that her expertise was valuable and her service had been appreciated despite the political circumstances that had ended her military career. Isabella accepted immediately, knowing that she would finally be able to use her knowledge and experience in service of the mission she had always embraced, protecting the lives of those who fly. Her first assignment took her back to the Air Force Academy, where she had begun her journey as a scared 18-year-old from Montana. Now she stood before a new generation of cadets, sharing the lessons learned from 23 years of military flying and one afternoon when everything she had learned made the difference between life and death for 127 people. Aviation is about more than just flying aircraft, she told them during her first lecture. It's about responsibility to your mission, to your crew, and to everyone whose safety depends on your expertise. Sometimes that responsibility will be recognized and celebrated. Sometimes it will be ignored or dismissed. But it never goes away, and it never stops being important. The cadets listened with the kind of attention that Isabella remembered from her own early training, when every lesson seemed to carry life or death significance. She could see herself reflected in their faces, the mixture of excitement and apprehension, the desire to prove themselves worthy of the trust that would be placed in them. After the lecture, a young female cadet approached her with a question that brought back memories of Isabella's own struggles to find her place in a male-dominated field. "Ma'am, how do you keep going when people don't believe in your abilities?" Isabella looked at this young woman, probably not much older than she had been when she first arrived at the academy, and felt the weight of experience and hard-won wisdom. "You prove them wrong," she said simply. "Not with words, but with actions. Not once, but every single day. And you remember that your expertise doesn't depend on other people's recognition. It depends on your commitment to excellence and your dedication to the mission." The cadet nodded thoughtfully, and Isabella could see the kind of determination that would carry her through the challenges ahead. It was the same determination that had sustained Isabella through her own career, through the political controversies and involuntary retirement, through 3 years of civilian life when her expertise seemed invisible and unvalued. Now, standing in the academy lecture hall where her own journey had begun, Isabella realized that her story had come full circle. She was no longer passenger 127, dismissed and ignored by those around her. She was Lieutenant Colonel Isabella Brown, United States Air Force, bringing her expertise full circle to serve the next generation of military aviators. The recognition she had received after the emergency landing was gratifying, but it wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was the knowledge that her years of training and service had prepared her for the moment when 127 lives depended on her expertise. What mattered was the certainty that she had answered the call when it came, regardless of how others initially perceived her qualifications. As she walked across the academy grounds after her lecture, Isabella felt a deep sense of peace that had been absent from her life for 3 years. The mountain air was crisp and clear, carrying the sounds of cadets training for the challenges that would define their careers. She was home again, not just in a physical sense, but in the deeper meaning of purpose and service that had always defined her identity. That evening, she made an entry in her leather journal, the same journal that had traveled with her from cadet to squadron, commander to civilian to honored consultant. "Today, I spoke to cadets about responsibility and recognition," she wrote in her careful script. "I told them that expertise doesn't depend on others' acknowledgement, but I realize now that recognition does matter not for ego, but for effectiveness. When expertise is dismissed, lives are at risk. When it's acknowledged and supported, lives are saved. The challenge is finding ways to ensure that valuable knowledge is heard and respected, regardless of who possesses it or how it's presented." She closed the journal and looked out her quarters window at the lights of Colorado Springs below, thinking about the young mother and her children, the businessman, the elderly man, and all the other passengers whose lives had been preserved by a moment when expertise was finally recognized and acted upon. Tomorrow she would begin developing new training protocols designed to help commercial flight crews recognize and respond to passenger input that might be critical to flight safety. It was unglamorous work compared to flying F-22s in combat, but it was essential work that could prevent future tragedies. Isabella Brown, no longer passenger 127, was exactly where she belonged. 3 years later, the auditorium at the International Aviation Safety Conference in Las Vegas was packed to capacity, with additional attendees watching via video link from conference rooms around the world. Isabella Brown stood at the podium, looking out at an audience of pilots, engineers, safety investigators, and aviation officials who had gathered to hear about the revolutionary changes in emergency response protocols that had emerged from the United Flight 847 incident when I boarded that aircraft as passenger 127, she began, her voice carrying easily through the large space. I never imagined that my experience would lead to fundamental changes in how the aviation industry recognizes and responds to expertise in crisis situations. The presentation she was about to give had been requested by the International Civil Aviation Organization, the Federal Aviation Administration, and aviation safety organizations on 6 continents. The Brown Protocol, as it had come to be known, had been implemented by major airlines worldwide and was credited with preventing at least 12 potential disasters in the 3 years since its introduction. The protocol was elegantly simple in concept but revolutionary in practice. It established formal procedures for flight crews to evaluate and act upon passenger input during emergency situations, with special emphasis on identifying individuals with relevant technical expertise. More importantly, it mandated that such evaluations be based on knowledge and experience rather than appearance or initial impressions. The lesson of Flight 847 isn't that we should always listen to passenger concerns, Isabella explained to her audience. It's that we should have systematic ways to identify when those concerns might be based on genuine expertise rather than anxiety or misunderstanding. In the audience, she could see familiar faces: Captain Hayes, who had become a vocal advocate for aviation safety reform; Major Rodriguez, now Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez, who had helped develop the military coordination aspects of the protocol; and First Officer Chun, who had been promoted to captain and served as a consultant on crew resource management training. The changes that had emerged from that afternoon over Missouri extended far beyond aviation safety protocols. Isabella's story had sparked broader conversations about expertise, recognition, and the ways that valuable knowledge could be overlooked when it came from unexpected sources. The Harvard Business School had developed a case study based on the incident, examining how organizations could better identify and utilize expertise regardless of how it was packaged or presented. Academic conferences had been held on the topic of hidden expertise in everything from medical emergencies to corporate decision-making. The Isabella Brown Institute for Applied Expertise, founded at the University of Colorado with funding from aerospace companies, was conducting research on how to improve recognition and utilization of knowledge in high-stakes situations. But perhaps the most meaningful changes were happening in the lives of individuals whose experiences echoed Isabella's journey from recognition to dismissal to vindication. 5 years later, David Martinez, the young Marine veteran whom Isabella had met at that Denver airport workshop, stood before a group of corporate executives in a Chicago boardroom, explaining how his military logistics experience could streamline their supply chain operations. Unlike his first attempts to translate his skills into civilian language, David now spoke with quiet confidence about managing complex operations under time pressure and coordinating resources across multiple stakeholders in dynamic environments. The change in his presentation style wasn't accidental. It was the result of training he had received through the Veterans Expertise Translation Program, an initiative that had grown out of Isabella's work with transitioning military personnel. The program, now operating in 12 major cities, helped veterans communicate their skills in ways that civilian employers could understand and value. The key insight that Colonel Brown taught us, David explained to the executives, is that expertise doesn't lose value. When you change environments, it just needs to be communicated differently. David's success story was being replicated across the country as the program helped thousands of veterans find meaningful civilian employment. The corporate world was beginning to recognize that military training produced exactly the kind of leadership, decision-making, and crisis management skills that were increasingly valuable in complex business environments. 7 years later at the Air Force Academy, Cadet First Class Sarah Kien, no relation to the first officer from Flight 847, was preparing for her capstone project on crisis leadership. She had chosen to study the Brown Protocol implementation, interviewing Isabella and other participants in the original incident as part of her research. "What strikes me most about the whole situation," Sarah wrote in her thesis, "is how close we came to losing 127 lives simply because expertise was initially dismissed based on appearance and context, rather than content and qualifications." Sarah's work was part of a new curriculum at the Paseo Academy that emphasized the importance of recognizing and utilizing expertise wherever it might be found. The program, developed with Isabella's consultation, trained future officers to look beyond rank, uniform, and credentials to identify knowledge and experience that could be crucial in emergency situations. Academy had also established the Isabella Brown Award for Innovation in Crisis Leadership, recognizing cadets who demonstrated exceptional ability to think creatively and use available resources during simulated emergency situations. The award had become one of the most prestigious honors a cadet could receive, representing the kind of practical problem-solving that the Academy sought to cultivate in future Air Force officers. 10 years later, the retirement ceremony at Whiteman Air Force Base was unlike any that had been held in the facility's history. Isabella Brown, now 68 years old, was ending her second career with the Air Force, this time as a civilian consultant whose work had influenced aviation safety policies worldwide. The ceremony was attended by officials from every branch of the military, representatives from major airlines, and aviation safety experts from around the world. Most meaningfully for Isabella, it was attended by many of the 127 passengers from United Flight 847, now scattered across the country, but united in their gratitude for the expertise that had saved their lives. The young mother from Seat 13B, now a successful attorney, had brought her teenage children to meet the woman who had made their lives possible. The businessman from 12E had become a vocal advocate for aviation safety and had endowed a scholarship program for women pursuing careers in aerospace engineering. The elderly man who had slept through most of the crisis had passed away 3 years earlier, but his family attended to express gratitude for the additional time with their father that Isabella's expertise had provided. "When I look back on that day," Isabella said in her retirement speech, "I don't think about the recognition that followed or the changes that emerged. I think about the moment when expertise was finally heard and acted upon. That's the moment when everything we train for becomes worthwhile, when knowledge serves its purpose and lives are preserved." The speech was carried live on military television networks and aviation industry websites, watched by thousands of people whose own careers had been influenced by Isabella's example. Young pilots starting their careers, experienced aviators working in commercial aviation, safety investigators examining accident reports, and military personnel serving in every corner of the world, all of them part of a community that had been changed by the events of one afternoon over Missouri. After the ceremony, Isabella walked through the aircraft display area at Whiteman's Museum, pausing before an F-22 Raptor that was identical to the aircraft she had flown in combat missions around the world. A group of young visitors, part of a summer aviation camp, were examining the fighter with the kind of wide-eyed enthusiasm that she remembered from her own childhood fascination with flight. One of the girls, probably about 12 years old, looked up at Isabella with curiosity. "Did you ever fly one of these?" the girl asked. Isabella smiled, remembering her own childhood dreams and the long journey that had taken her from a small town in Montana to the cockpit of the world's most advanced fighter aircraft, to a moment of crisis where all that training had mattered more than she could have imagined. "Yes," she said simply. "I did. What was it like?" Isabella considered the question, thinking about combat missions and training flights, about the political controversies and personal costs, about the afternoon when her expertise had been dismissed and then vindicated in the most dramatic way possible. "It was an honor," she said finally. "Every single day, it was an honor to serve." The girl nodded thoughtfully, and Isabella could see the kind of dreaming that had once driven her own ambitions. Perhaps this young visitor would one day follow a similar path, facing her own challenges and proving her own expertise in moments when it mattered most. 15 years later, the documentary crew arrived at Isabella's Colorado home on a crisp autumn morning, their equipment trucks parked carefully on the quiet residential street where she had lived since her retirement. The film they were producing, titled Passenger 127, When Expertise Goes Unheard, was the culmination of a 5-year project examining the broader implications of her story. Isabella, now 73, moved with the careful precision of someone whose body carried the accumulated wear of a lifetime in aviation, but whose mind remained sharp and engaged. She had agreed to participate in the documentary as a way to ensure that the lessons of Flight 847 would continue to reach new audiences. "The story that people usually tell about that day," she said to the camera, "focuses on the drama of the emergency landing and the military response. But for me, the most important part was the 45 minutes when my expertise was dismissed. That's where the real lesson lies in understanding how easily we can overlook the knowledge and experience that might save lives." The documentary would go on to win several awards and be used in training programs for aviation personnel, emergency responders, and corporate managers around the world. But its greatest impact would be in the countless individual situations where viewers remembered Isabella's story and chose to listen more carefully when someone with unexpected expertise offered crucial information. Ripple effects of that decision continued to spread through the aviation community and beyond, creating a culture where knowledge was valued regardless of its source, and where expertise was recognized even when it came without credentials or official authority. 20 years later, dedication ceremony for the Isabella Brown Center for Aviation Safety at Colorado Springs Airport brought together the largest gathering of aviation professionals in the city's history. The facility, funded by contributions from airlines, aerospace manufacturers, and the families of the Flight 847 passengers, would serve as a research and training center focused on emergency response and crisis management. Isabella, now 78, sat in the place of honor as speakers described the impact of her work on aviation safety worldwide. Statistics were presented showing the lives saved by implementation of the Brown Protocol, now numbering in the thousands. Stories were shared of emergency situations where passenger expertise had been properly recognized and utilized, preventing potential disasters. But the moment that moved Isabella most deeply came when Captain Maria Santos of United Airlines approached the podium. Santos had been a young pilot trainee at the time of the Flight 847 incident, and her career had been shaped by the lessons learned from that emergency. "Colonel Brown," Santos said, looking directly at Isabella, "you taught us that expertise doesn't come with a uniform or a title. It comes with knowledge, experience, and the courage to speak up when lives are at stake. Every safe flight I've completed, every emergency I've handled, every passenger I've brought home safely, all of it builds on the foundation you established when you refused to be ignored." The standing ovation that followed lasted for several minutes, with aviation professionals from around the world expressing their gratitude for the changes Isabella had brought to their industry. But for Isabella, the most meaningful recognition came from knowing that future passengers would never again be dismissed simply because their expertise came without official credentials. Present day Isabella Brown, now 83 years old, sits in her study surrounded by the accumulated artifacts of a life dedicated to aviation and service. The walls are lined with photographs spanning decades, images of her in Air Force dress blues, receiving commendations, candid shots from combat deployments, formal portraits from her years as a squadron commander, and more recent pictures from aviation safety conferences and retirement ceremonies. On her desk sits the same leather journal that has accompanied her since her first day at the Air Force Academy, now filled with thousands of entries documenting a career that transformed from personal achievement to global impact. The worn challenge coin from her squadron still rests in a place of honor, its edges polished smooth by decades of nervous handling during moments of crisis and decision. But the most treasured items in her collection are the letters, hundreds of them, from passengers whose lives were saved not just on Flight 847, but on subsequent flights where the Brown Protocol had prevented disasters. Letters from pilots who had learned to listen more carefully to unusual observations. Letters from aviation safety investigators who had found new approaches to examining accidents and incidents. Letters from young women pursuing careers in aviation who had been inspired by her example of perseverance in the face of institutional dismissal. Today's letter arrived just this morning, written in the careful script of someone unaccustomed to formal correspondence. Dear Colonel Brown, my name is Jennifer Walsh, and I am the granddaughter of Harold Walsh, who was passenger 43 on United Flight 847. Grandpa passed away last month at the age of 92, and in going through his papers, I found a folder he had kept about that flight and about you. Grandpa never talked much about what happened that day, but I can see from his collection of newspaper clippings and magazine articles that he followed your career closely after the emergency landing. He kept every story about the Brown Protocol, every article about your work in aviation safety, every mention of awards and recognitions you received. I'm writing because I wanted you to know that Grandpa lived to see the birth of 4 great-grandchildren, including my daughter Sarah, who just started her freshman year at the Air Force Academy. She's planning to study aeronautical engineering, and she says she wants to be a pilot like the woman who saved her great-grandfather's life. Grandpa always said that the 25 years he lived after that flight were a gift that you gave him. He used those years to watch his family grow, to travel with my grandmother to places they had always dreamed of seeing, and to volunteer with veterans, organizations helping other people transition to civilian life. I thought you should know that your expertise didn't just save 127 lives that day. It created thousands of moments of joy, celebration, and love that wouldn't have existed otherwise. Sarah will carry your example with her as she begins her own journey in aviation, and someday she passed that inspiration on to others. Thank you for refusing to be ignored when it mattered most. With gratitude, Jennifer Walsh. Isabella folds the letter carefully and places it with the others in a wooden box that has grown heavy with similar expressions of thanks over the years. Each letter represents lives that continued beyond that afternoon over Missouri, families that remained intact, dreams that were allowed to flourish. She opens her journal to a fresh page and begins to write. Today I received another reminder of why expertise must never be dismissed based on appearances or assumptions. 28 years have passed since Flight 847, and the ripple effects continue to spread through the aviation community and beyond. Young people who weren't even born when that emergency occurred are now building careers influenced by the lessons learned from those crucial minutes when knowledge was initially ignored and then finally heard. Most important lesson isn't about aviation safety or emergency procedures. It's about the responsibility. We all have to recognize and value expertise wherever it appears, regardless of who possesses it or how it's presented. Every person carries knowledge and experience that could prove crucial in the right circumstances. The challenge is creating cultures and systems that can identify and utilize that expertise before lives are at stake. I have been privileged to live long enough to see the changes that emerged from that day, to know that future passengers will be heard when they have important information to share. To watch young aviators learn from the beginning of their careers that expertise is a precious resource that must never be wasted. If I have contributed anything meaningful to the world of aviation, it is the understanding that knowledge belongs not to institutions or titles, but to individuals who have earned it through experience and dedication. That knowledge must be recognized, respected, and utilized whenever it can serve the cause of safety and service. The sky is vast, and there is always more to learn, always more to share, always another opportunity to ensure that expertise serves its highest purpose, protecting the lives of those who fly and those who depend on safe skies for their own dreams and destinations. She closes the journal and looks out her study window at the Colorado mountains that have framed her view for so many years. Somewhere in those skies, aircraft are carrying passengers who trust that the people responsible for their safety will listen to important information regardless of where it comes from. Somewhere, young pilots are learning that expertise can appear in unexpected forms and must always be taken seriously. Somewhere, the next generation of aviators is preparing for careers built on the understanding that knowledge and experience are too valuable to be dismissed or ignored. Isabella Brown, who began her journey as passenger 127 and became a symbol of expertise recognized and respected, has lived to see her most important mission accomplished, ensuring that no one with crucial knowledge would ever again be dismissed simply because they didn't look like what others expected expertise to look like. The afternoon sun streams through her study windows, illuminating the photographs, awards, and letters that document a life of service that continued long after her official retirement. It has been a good life, measured not in personal achievements, but in lives saved, knowledge shared, and barriers broken for those who would follow. In the distance, she can hear the sound of aircraft engines, commercial airliners carrying passengers safely to their destinations, military aircraft preparing for training missions, private planes piloted by people pursuing their own aviation dreams. Each aircraft represents the continuation of the mission that has defined her entire adult life, the sacred responsibility of safe flight and the knowledge that expertise, when properly recognized and utilized, makes all the difference between tragedy and triumph. Isabella Brown, passenger 127, Lieutenant Colonel, safety consultant, and guardian of aviation expertise, listens to those engine sounds with the satisfaction of someone who knows that her life's work will continue in the hands of others long after her own flying days are over. The sky, as always, calls to those who understand its challenges and respect its demands. And thanks in part to her example, that call will continue to be answered by people whose expertise is recognized and valued, regardless of how or when or where it appears. The morning of Isabella's 85th birthday arrived with the kind of crisp, Colorado clarity that had always reminded her why she had chosen to make this place her home. Sunlight streamed through the windows of her study, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny aircraft in the golden air. She had risen early, as was her custom, but today she moved more slowly, her body acknowledging the accumulated weight of decades in aviation. The phone had been ringing since dawn. Calls from former squadron members, aviation safety officials, and the families of Flight 847 passengers who had made it their tradition to reach out on this day. Each conversation brought its own warmth, its own reminder of lives that had intersected with hers in meaningful ways. But the call she treasured most came at precisely 0800 hours, military time that had never left her vocabulary. "Happy birthday, Colonel," said the familiar voice of Sarah Martinez, the granddaughter of passenger Harold Walsh, now Captain Martinez of the United States Air Force. "I wanted to be the first to tell you I got my orders yesterday. I'm being assigned to the 94th Fighter Squadron." Isabella felt a profound satisfaction at the news. The young woman who had been inspired by her great-grandfather's story was now following in Isabella's own footsteps, taking command of the same squadron that Isabella had once led. The circle was complete in a way that felt both planned and miraculous. "Congratulations, Captain," Isabella replied, her voice carrying the weight of institutional memory and personal pride. "The 94th is getting an exceptional officer. Your great-grandfather would be proud." After the call ended, Isabella made her way to the kitchen and prepared her morning coffee with the same methodical precision she had always brought to pre-flight preparations. Today, however, she carried her cup to the living room instead of her study, settling into the comfortable chair that faced the large window overlooking the mountains. On the side table next to her chair lay a manila envelope that had arrived by special courier the previous evening. The return address indicated it had come from the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., and Isabella had been saving it for this morning, knowing that its contents would provide the perfect capstone to her birthday reflections. She opened the envelope carefully, revealing a formal letter written on museum letterhead. "Dear Colonel Brown, it is our distinct honor to inform you that the Smithsonian Institution has voted unanimously to establish the Isabella Brown Gallery of Aviation Safety and Crisis Leadership. The gallery will be housed in a dedicated wing of the National Air and Space Museum and will tell the story of how expertise, when properly recognized and utilized, can prevent tragedy and save lives. The centerpiece of the exhibition will be a detailed recreation of the Flight 847 emergency, including the actual cockpit voice recorder transcripts, passenger testimonials, and interactive displays that allow visitors to experience the decision-making process that led to the successful emergency landing. We believe this story represents one of the most important lessons in aviation history, that knowledge and experience must be valued, regardless of their source. In addition to the Flight 847 display, the gallery will feature exhibits on aviation safety innovations, emergency response protocols, and the stories of other individuals whose expertise has prevented disasters in various fields. The goal is to create an educational experience that inspires future aviators and safety professionals, while honoring those whose knowledge has protected countless lives. We would be honored if you would serve as the consulting curator for this project and participate in the gallery's dedication ceremony, scheduled for Memorial Day weekend. Your insights would be invaluable in ensuring that the exhibits accurately capture both the technical aspects of aviation safety and the human elements of recognition and response in crisis situations. Gallery is expected to receive over 1 million visitors annually, making it one of the most significant educational resources dedicated to aviation safety in the world. Your story will inspire generations of aviators, safety professionals, and ordinary citizens who may one day find themselves in situations where their expertise could make the difference between tragedy and triumph. With deepest respect and gratitude, Dr. Michael Harrison, Director, National Air and Space Museum. Isabella set the letter down and looked out at the mountains, feeling a deep sense of completion that she had rarely experienced in her life. The gallery would ensure that the lessons of Flight 847 would continue to reach new audiences long after she was gone, creating an institutional memory that would preserve the importance of recognizing expertise wherever it appeared. But more than that, it represented a fundamental shift in how society viewed knowledge and authority. The fact that a major national museum would dedicate significant resources to telling the story of a dismissed passenger whose warnings had saved lives spoke to broader changes in how institutions approached expertise and decision-making. Her telephone rang again, and Isabella recognized the number as belonging to Dr. Jennifer Chun, the director of the Isabella Brown Institute for Applied Expertise at the University of Colorado. The institute had grown from its modest beginnings into a nationally recognized research center that studied how organizations could better identify and utilize expertise in crisis situations. Colonel Brown, Dr. Chun said, "I hope you're having a wonderful birthday. I wanted to share some news that I think you'll find meaningful. We just received confirmation that our research methodology has been adopted by NASA for their mission safety protocols. Your insights about recognizing unexpected expertise are now being used to protect astronauts and space missions. Isabella smiled at the irony of her influence extending even beyond aviation into the realm of space exploration. That's remarkable news, Jennifer. I never imagined that those 45 minutes on Flight 847 would have implications for space travel. That's the beauty of fundamental principles, Dr. Chun replied. When you identify something truly important about human behavior and organizational dynamics, it applies across all kinds of situations. We've now documented over 2,000 cases where the Brown Protocol or related principles have prevented accidents, improved decision-making, or saved lives in fields ranging from medical emergencies to nuclear power plant operations. After Dr. Chun's call, Isabella spent the morning reading through a collection of letters and documents that had accumulated over the years. Each piece represented a life touched, a lesson learned, or a principle applied in service of safety and effectiveness. There were thank you notes from passengers, research papers citing her work, photographs from speaking engagements, and official commendations from organizations around the world. One document in particular caught her attention, a handwritten letter from Marcus Thompson, the flight attendant who had initially dismissed her concerns on Flight 847. The letter had arrived 5 years earlier, but Isabella had kept it as a reminder of the complexity of human judgment and the importance of learning from mistakes. Colonel Brown, I know this letter is long overdue, and I'm not sure I'll ever have the courage to send it. But I wanted you to know that not a day has passed since that flight when I haven't thought about how close we came to losing everyone aboard because I was too focused on protocol to recognize expertise. I've spent the last 20 years working in aviation safety training, helping flight crews learn to identify and respond to passenger input that might be critical to flight safety. Every time I teach the Brown Protocol, I tell the story of my own failure to listen, hoping that other crew members will learn from my mistake. You saved 127 lives that day despite my initial dismissal of your warnings. I will spend the rest of my career trying to ensure that no other flight crew makes the same error in judgment that I made. Thank you for your patience, your expertise, and your refusal to give up when lives were at stake. With profound regret and deepest respect. Marcus Thompson. Isabella had responded to that letter with grace and forgiveness, recognizing that Marcus's experience had transformed him into one of aviation safety's most effective advocates. His story had become an integral part of crew resource management training, demonstrating how even well-intentioned professionals could overlook crucial information if they relied too heavily on assumptions about authority and credibility. As the afternoon approached, Isabella prepared for her birthday celebration, a small gathering of close friends and colleagues who had shared her journey through the aviation safety revolution. The guest list included Captain Hayes, who had remained a close friend and frequent collaborator, Dr. Chun from the Institute, several former Flight 847 passengers, and a handful of aviation safety professionals whose careers had been shaped by the principles that had emerged from that emergency landing. The celebration was held in the community room of Isabella's retirement complex, a space that had been decorated with photographs and memorabilia from her career. A large banner read, "Happy 85th Birthday, Colonel Brown, thank you for teaching us to listen," and the walls displayed images spanning decades of service, from her Air Force Academy graduation to recent speaking engagements. But the most moving moment of the celebration came when Captain Maria Santos, now a senior training executive with United Airlines, presented Isabella with a specially commissioned piece of art. The sculpture, created by a metalworker who had served in the Air Force, was crafted from materials taken from decommissioned F-22 aircraft and formed into the shape of a commercial airliner in flight. "This represents the bridge you built," Captain Santos explained. between military aviation and civilian safety, between expertise and recognition, between knowledge and action. You showed us that the principles of safe flight transcend any single aircraft or organization. They belong to everyone who has the courage to speak up when lives are at stake. The sculpture would eventually find its place in the Smithsonian Gallery, but for now it sat in a position of honor in Isabella's living room, catching the afternoon light and casting shadows that resembled aircraft in formation. As evening approached and the guests departed, Isabella found herself alone with Captain Hayes, who had volunteered to help with cleanup, but was primarily interested in having a private conversation about the impact of their shared experience. "You know, Isabella," he said as they arranged chairs in the community room, "I've thought a lot about the randomness of that day. If you hadn't been on that flight, if Major Rodriguez hadn't been there to provide military credibility, if I hadn't been willing to listen, how different things might have been." Isabella considered his observation carefully. "I think the lesson isn't about randomness, Mike. It's about preparedness meeting opportunity. I was prepared because of 23 years of training and experience. You were prepared because of your own aviation background and commitment to safety. Major Rodriguez was prepared because of his military training and respect for expertise. The system worked because all of us were ready to fulfill our roles when the moment required it. But what if you hadn't been there at all?" Hayes pressed. "What if that expertise hadn't been available? Then we would have learned different lessons from the tragedy that followed." Isabella replied with the kind of philosophical acceptance that came from decades of experience with the unpredictability of life. "But the point is that expertise exists everywhere, in every field, carried by people who may not look like what we expect experts to look like. Our job is to create systems and cultures that can recognize and utilize that knowledge before it's too late." Captain Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "The Brown Protocol isn't really about aviation, is it? It's about human nature and institutional behavior." "Exactly," Isabella said. "Aviation was just the context where we learned these lessons in a way that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. But the principles apply anywhere that knowledge and decision-making intersect." As they finished cleaning up, Isabella reflected on the broader implications of their conversation. The story of Flight 847 had resonated so widely precisely because it represented universal themes: the struggle to be heard, the importance of expertise, the consequences of dismissing knowledge based on appearances or assumptions. That evening, alone in her apartment, Isabella made what would be her final entry in the leather journal that had accompanied her throughout her career. "Tonight, I celebrated my 85th birthday, surrounded by people whose lives were changed by the events of one afternoon over Missouri. The gathering reminded me that the most important measure of a life well lived isn't personal achievement or recognition, but the positive impact we have on others and the contributions we make to causes larger than ourselves. The Smithsonian Gallery will preserve the story of Flight 847 for future generations. But the real memorial to that day exists in the lives that have been saved by the principles we learned from the emergency. Every flight crew that listens more carefully to passenger concerns, every organization that creates better systems for recognizing expertise, every individual who speaks up when they possess knowledge that could prevent tragedy, all of them are living extensions of the lesson we learned that day. I began my career as a young woman trying to prove herself worthy of opportunities that had never been given to someone like me. I am ending it as someone who helped change the conversation about expertise, authority, and the responsibility we all share to recognize knowledge wherever it appears. The sky has been my classroom, my workplace, and my sanctuary for over 6 decades. It has taught me that safety depends not on any single individual, but on communities of people committed to supporting each other and utilizing every available resource to protect the lives entrusted to their care. If I have contributed anything meaningful to the world of aviation, It is the understanding that expertise belongs to everyone who has earned it through experience and dedication. That expertise must be recognized, respected, and utilized whenever it can serve the cause of safety and service. Tomorrow, other flights will carry passengers safely to their destinations. Other emergencies will be handled with skill and professionalism, and other experts will step forward when their knowledge is needed most. The sky continues to call to those who understand its challenges and accept its responsibilities, have been privileged to answer that call and to help others. Recognize the importance of listening when expertise speaks, regardless of the form it takes or the source from which it comes. Isabella closed the journal and placed it in the wooden box with the others' decades of entries documenting a career that had evolved from personal ambition to institutional change to global impact. The progression felt natural and complete, a life's work that had begun with individual dreams and culminated in collective transformation. 2 weeks later, Isabella Brown passed away peacefully in her sleep, her death as quiet and dignified as her life had been purposeful and impactful. The news of her passing was reported in aviation publications around the world, each obituary emphasizing not just her military achievements or the Flight 847 emergency, but the lasting changes she had brought to how society recognized and valued expertise. The memorial service was held at the Air Force Academy Chapel, with speakers representing every phase of her remarkable life. Captain Sarah Martinez, now the commanding officer of the 94th Fighter Squadron, delivered the primary eulogy, speaking about Isabella as both a professional role model and a personal inspiration. Colonel Brown taught us that expertise is not diminished by time, context, or appearance, Martinez said to an audience that filled every seat in the chapel. It is only diminished when we fail to recognize it, respect it, and act upon it when lives are at stake. She saved 127 lives on Flight 847, but her real legacy is in the thousands of lives that have been saved since then by people who learn to listen when expertise speaks. Processional included an F-22 flyover conducted by pilots from Isabella's former squadron, their aircraft forming the missing man formation that honored fallen aviators. But the most fitting tribute came from the commercial aircraft that altered their routes to pass over the chapel during the service. Pilots from around the world who wanted to honor the woman who had helped make their profession safer and more effective. Isabella was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, her grave marker bearing the simple inscription, Lieutenant Colonel Isabella Brown, United States Air Force. She taught us to listen. The graveside service was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by her example, from Flight 847 passengers to aviation safety professionals to young pilots who had never met her but had been influenced by her principles. The Isabella Brown Gallery at the Smithsonian opened 6 months after her death, becoming one of the museum's most popular exhibits. Visitors from around the world came to learn about the woman who had transformed aviation safety by refusing to be ignored when lives were at stake. The interactive displays allowed guests to experience the decision-making process of the Flight 847 emergency, while educational programs taught the principles of expertise recognition to students, professionals, and the general public. But perhaps the most meaningful legacy was found in the countless everyday situations where people remembered Isabella's story and chose to listen more carefully when someone with unexpected expertise offered important information. Emergency rooms where nurses' observations were taken more seriously by doctors. Corporate boardrooms where unconventional ideas were evaluated on their merits rather than their sources. Classrooms where teachers learned to recognize knowledge that students brought from their own experiences. In each of these situations, the spirit of Passenger 127 lived on, the understanding that expertise could appear anywhere. That knowledge was too valuable to be dismissed based on appearances, and that the courage to speak up when lives were at stake was a responsibility shared by everyone who possessed relevant experience. The story of Isabella Brown had become larger than any single individual or incident. It had become a principle, a standard, and a reminder that in a complex world filled with unexpected challenges, our best defense against tragedy was our willingness to recognize and utilize expertise wherever it could be found. Years would pass. New aviation safety challenges would emerge, and new generations of pilots, safety professionals, and passengers would take to the skies. But the lesson of Flight 847 would endure, that knowledge is precious, expertise is essential, and the courage to speak up when lives are at stake is among the highest forms of service any individual can provide. Isabella Brown, who had begun as a scared 8-year-old from Montana and evolved into a global symbol of expertise, recognized and respected, had achieved the kind of immortality that comes not from personal fame, but from principles that outlive any individual life. Her voice would continue to be heard whenever someone chose to listen to unexpected expertise, whenever knowledge was valued over assumptions, and whenever the safety of others took precedence over the comfort of conventional thinking. The sky, vast and demanding and full of both promise and peril, would continue to call to new generations of aviators who understood that expertise was not a privilege to be hoarded, but a responsibility to be shared. And in their willingness to listen, to learn, and to act when knowledge demanded action, the legacy of Passenger 127 would continue to protect lives and serve the cause of safe flight for generations yet to come. In the end, Isabella Brown's greatest achievement was not saving 127 lives on a single afternoon, remarkable as that had been. It was changing the conversation about expertise itself, ensuring that knowledge would be valued wherever it appeared, that experience would be respected regardless of its source, and that the courage to speak truth to authority would be recognized as among the highest forms of service. Her story had become a reminder that we are all, in some sense, passengers on the same journey, dependent on each other's knowledge, experience, and willingness to step forward when our expertise can make the difference between tragedy and triumph. And in that shared responsibility, the spirit of Lieutenant Colonel Isabella Brown, United States Air Force, Passenger 127, and guardian of aviation safety, would fly on forever. Preparing and narrating this type of story takes a lot of time and effort. If you like the story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you want to watch every story of our channel, turn on the bell icon.